Good afternoon, everyone. It is Tuesday. It is 4 p.m. ET, and we are so pleased that you have found us here on A Mighty Blaze on Crime Time. 4 p.m. ET on Tuesdays is indeed Crime Time, and I am your host, Hank Phillippi Ryan, the USA Today bestselling author of 13 going on 14 novels of suspense. Her Perfect Life is the current one. The new one, The House Guest, is coming up in February, and you will seriously be hearing way too much about that book as the time gets closer. But let me welcome you all here today. I see Pamela and so many people joining us this afternoon to hear about Child Zero by Chris Holm. I am telling you, I wasn't quite sure whether I was going to tell you all this, but my husband was reading it. You can see his bookmark is still in it. And I said, I need to interview Chris, sweetheart, so I need to have this book. And I opened it and I started reading it, and my eyes got bigger and bigger and bigger, Chris. And I thought, this is the scariest book I have ever read. And I was just devouring it. After I was initially thinking, I don't know if this is too scary for me, it was just fabulous and fast-paced and gripping. And, I don't want to say unputdownable because that sounds so silly, but Mighty Blaze is saying, scary book alert. Definitely so. Hey, Catherine. Hey, Lynn. Thank you so much for being with us today. So, Chris, your book, Child Zero, it is chilling. It is prophetic. It came out May 10th. So as soon as the show is over today, you all can run right out and get your copy of Child Zero. Highly, highly, highly recommended. Let me read you from, I'm going to let you talk in 1 second, Chris, I promise you all. Let me read you from the Publishers Weekly starred review. And that is such an important thing to get. It says, could a future pandemic be exponentially worse than COVID-19? Holm answers yes in this alarmingly plausible thriller. Absolutely so. Holm perfectly balances plot, characterizations, and science. And I love that description because those are the three pillars of this book. What did you think, Chris? Welcome. What did you think when you saw that marvelous review?
Well, first off, thank you so much for having me. And secondly, my background is in science. And so I knew I had the science stuff nailed. What's such a relief for me with these reviews is that the thrills and the characterization are also getting accolades, because let's face it, science isn't always the sexiest of topics. And so I feel like as a scientist and a thriller writer, I've done my job right if people can read something as potentially nerdy as this, which is about a post-antibiotic era, and still come away thinking it was gripping and thrilling and yes, terrifying.
Well, we can talk about this more, and we certainly will. But I mean, you make science cool, and it is cool. And one of the things that's fun about reading this is that it makes the reader feel really smart and as if they understand the world in a different way. And you will never look at the world the same way again after reading this book, I have to say. I mean, you love science because science is cool. It's the answer to the universe.
Yeah, I mean, I think I like science because I'm a giant nerd, but I also do. I think that, for me, science and mysteries have so much in common. I grew up as a mystery reader and I grew up as a science nerd, and it's all really about, solving puzzles. It's all puzzles. And so to me, the science brain and the mystery brain are very much the same. And so it's gratifying to see that readers seem to be agreeing with me, and everyone who takes a peek at this thing can't seem to put it down.
Absolutely so. And it was interesting. There was an article in the paper here in Boston the other day about the scientist who tracked down, who diagnosed finally the monkeypox case, and how she did that exactly like a detective. She is a detective, tracks down the answer to a deadly puzzle. And it was absolutely fascinating to see. Let me take a minute before we talk more about Child Zero to remind you that you are here at A Mighty Blaze on Facebook. A Mighty Blaze was started at the beginning of the pandemic by the fabulous powerhouse duo of Jenna Blum and Caroline Levitt to keep us all reading, to keep us all together, to keep this reading and writing community linked and discovering new books and discovering new authors. And that is exactly why we are here today. And as Margaret in the back room says, you can support the Blaze and grab your copy of Child Zero on Bookshop right here. Please do that. Not right now, not right now. In about 35 minutes. You can go grab it, unless you can do it while you listen to us. Let me quickly tell you about Chris Holm. Chris Holm is the author of the cross-genre collector trilogy, which is quite chilling. The Michael Hendricks thrillers, one of my husband's and my favorite books, love those, and the standalone biological thriller Child Zero. His work has been selected for the Best American Mystery Stories, named a New York Times Editor's Choice, and won a number of awards, Chris has, including the 2016 Anthony Award for Best Novel. He lives in Portland, Maine, with his fabulous, brilliant, wonderful wife, and we welcome you here today. Chris, has this been great, the launch of this book?
It's been a kick. It's been so much fun. This one was long gestating for me. It took almost 5 years to write, and then obviously another year of editing before it came out. And so this has been a story that's lived in my head, and only in my head, for a very long time. It's been really gratifying to get out in the world and have people finally get a sense of what I've been working on all this time, and it's been overwhelmingly positive, which is gratifying, because I feel like if you dedicate that much of your life to a project, you'd hate to see it received any less than enthusiastically.
Well, I wonder if it's and we'll talk about the book in a minute, I promise you all. And Catherine is even asking, did you begin writing this before or after the COVID pandemic? And that is a brilliant question, but I'm wondering, and we'll get to that, but I'm wondering if, because all of us have been so immersed in science and epidemiology over the past couple of years, maybe this was kind of crazily the perfect time for it. Our minds are open to it. Our brains are open to it. We have a basis of understanding.
You know, it's interesting because you mentioned the scientist who actually tracked down the origins of this recent monkeypox. That was originally my career goal. I wanted to be a bug hunter for the CDC. I was serious enough about it that I enrolled in a PhD program at the University of Virginia School of Medicine. I did a lot of tropical medicine research while I was there, and I actually ultimately left because I didn't feel like I had the dedication to spend every waking hour doing that, because I wanted to tell stories. I'm saying that to maybe the busiest person on the planet who knows a thing or two about juggling a high-profile job with writing to great effect. But that aside, you know, this was it was something that married my two absolute loves of the biological research and the thriller writing, and I thought that I would have to be an ambassador for just the ideas of how people investigate disease, because I didn't realize everybody was going to get a crash course in it that lasted going on 3 years now. As Catherine had asked whether or not I began writing before or after the pandemic, I began writing this in 2016. I finished my first draft when I want to say very early January 2020, when COVID numbers were still in the low 100s. And most scientists even thought that it would be a lot like SARS, and that it would burn hot and fast and then disappear. I did not have to change a single word based on how this pandemic unfolded. The only thing I will say is I went straight to everybody wearing disposable masks, electrostatic disposable masks in the book. And so when everybody started rushing to buy cloth masks, I thought, geez, I must have missed a trick. And then as it turns out, as COVID evolved and became more virulent, here we all are now with our disposable filtration masks. So I guess I was right on that all along. Certainly, I think I lose a few points in terms of my prognosticating abilities since it came out post-COVID. People already have lived in a world that looks quite a lot like the world of Child Zero. But I certainly think I've gained a little in terms of plausibility. I don't think I have to sell anyone on the plausibility of this book, which is both a blessing and a curse. Obviously, I would prefer that everyone thought this was a little far-fetched, because it would make life a lot less scary these days.
Well, I think that I think it's even more chilling, because now we do see that it is plausible. I was thinking about this quote from Rod Serling, of all people, who said something like, fantasy is the impossible made probable, and science fiction is the unlikely made possible. And your book is a science fiction thriller, which is the unlikely made super possible by reality. I mean, it really works.
Thank you. I actually would caution you on the unlikely thing, though. That's the big impetus behind this book for me as a scientist was that fellow scientists have been warning about the coming post-antibiotic era for decades, and largely the public has been unmoved by their warnings. I think the reason why is because it's a thorny concept to wrap your head around what a post-antibiotic world would look like. But scientists are not prone to hyperbole. If you think about Dr. Fauci behind the lectern, he's always very calm, very measured, very comforting. That's one of the reasons we tuned in to see him during the height of the pandemic. Also in Maine, we had Nirav Shah, the head of the Maine CDC, who's been a wonderful guide through this all. But they tend to be very, very circumspect in the way they speak. And yet, when it comes to the post-antibiotic world, just to cite a couple of quotes, in a 2014 World Health Organization report, it was written that a post-antibiotic era in which common infections and minor surgeries can kill, far from being an apocalyptic fantasy, is indeed a very real possibility for the 21st century. In a 2021 editorial for the journal Science, two physicians said, unless researchers develop new antibiotics and therapeutics, the decimation of modern medicine will soon become a reality. And to me, hearing scientists talk like that is terrifying. And I thought, I'm not scared as a scientist, as a researcher of infectious diseases. I'm not particularly frightened of, say, Ebola. Obviously, if I lived in a place where it was endemic, that would be a concern. But it's not a disease that we need to worry about spreading far and wide because it's relatively difficult to catch because it's only by fluids. And it's also, it burns so hot and fast, it doesn't necessarily spread too far. But when you talk about a disease like tuberculosis or pneumonic plague or, for example, coronavirus, suddenly the world becomes a very small place. And what happens in one corner of it can spread to another corner very, very quickly. And that, to me, was sort of the crux of the world building behind Child Zero and what I wanted to put on the page and say, listen, guys, this isn't just a matter of if you have an earache, they can't give you penicillin. This is far, far worse than that and far scarier.
So you're fun, Chris. You are a fun guy. I have to say, all of you should be reading Child Zero. It is one of those things that is enlightening and a cautionary tale and thought-provoking and revealing in so many ways. And Janine is saying history repeats itself, sadly. But let's rewind a little bit because you and I are just talking a million miles an hour because we've both read the book, but the people who are watching Mighty Blaze Crime Time today have not maybe read your book. So let's talk a little bit about basically how Child Zero begins and what world we're in when it starts.
Sure. So Child Zero, as I like to describe it, is a scientific thriller in the vein of Michael Crichton that takes place in a world reeling from the collapse of the antibiotic era. That means things like organ transplants or implants of any kind are no longer feasible. Things like steroid treatments, chemotherapy, they're now options of last resort because they decimate the immune system. Diseases long thought beaten come surging back. Food insecurity is a major issue because the livestock farming practices that keep up with our current demand are heavily dependent on antibiotics. And so there's a lot of ripples beyond simply the medical world as far as what's affected by this collapse. That said, I still think that although the science is a call to action and a bit of a warning, this isn't necessarily a pandemic novel. It's a novel, it's a breakneck thriller with a pandemic as its backdrop. If you strip away the science, what you're left with is the story of a young boy named Mateo, who's the sole survivor of an attack on a shantytown in Central Park. And the two detectives, Jacob Gibson and Amira Hassan, who are tasked with investigating that crime. And so really what it boils down to is a very human story about a little kid with a big secret that some very powerful people would do anything to learn.
And I love the description of a little kid with a big secret, because Matt is so much the center of the novel, as well as Jacob and Amira and the other characters who are so brilliantly drawn. I was when I was, gosh, it was 1980, and I was working in Atlanta, and I was reading The Stand,
Hmm.
and I called in sick to work because I thought, I've got to find out what happens. I've got to find out what happens. And this is really reminiscent of that, sort of a world in crisis, core family relationships, and love, and responsibility and ethics really taking center stage as the forces of whatever you want to call it, nature and human nature,
Mm-hmm.
try to take over. It reminds me of that. It reminds me of The Stand. It reminds me of the Andromeda Strain. It reminds me, and also The Hot Zone. The
Mm-hmm.
Hot Zone, which I was riveted to, which is nonfiction, which I'm sure you've all read. And Sherry's saying, "Can I call in reading to work?" Yes, indeed. You can call in reading. We here at Crime Time just have your employer call me. I'll talk her or him. What was the domino that fell in your brain when you began to write this, even before the pandemic? Was there a thing that happened, or was it just the knowledge of how antibiotics that were so brilliant initially began to, that I guess, is it that nature began to say, we're not going to let you work anymore, we're going to evolve so that these products don't work anymore?
Yeah, I think for me it was having a front row seat to this sort of research is fairly eye opening. This might sound silly to say, but people love to say in this country that evolution is just a theory. Well, the thing about that is evolution is a theory is a hypothesis that's supported by facts and data. Evolution is just a theory in most cases. When it comes to microbes, it's not a theory. You can watch it happen in real time because you can see generation after generation of them grow, and then they overcome our defenses. And so for me, I was struck by the fact that for a long time we were discouraging people from going into microbiology because we thought we were just batting cleanup. They're like, okay, we've got antibiotics, we've got vaccines, and really all the pieces are going to fall into place, and we should be pretty good from here on out. And as it turns out, that was very, very mistaken. And what's really interesting about it is it's mistaken because we didn't understand where this microbial resistance comes from. It turns out it's a really, really complicated mechanism that I'm going to simplify by saying that bacteria can get viruses just like people can. Their viruses, called bacteriophages, have this really funny habit where they take a little bit of genetic information out of one bacterium and then will later into another one. And it's actually by that method, it's almost like a Wi-Fi for bacteria, because they can exchange information without ever bumping into each other. It allows previously harmless bacteria to become virulent, and it also allows harmful bacteria to overcome our antibiotics. And when I started reading the research on that, I thought, well, that's definitely chilling, because the world of this book, it's not just the fact that older antibiotics are overrun and we need new ones. It's that this virus gets released from the permafrost, thanks to global warming, and allows all bacteria all over the world to adapt to any new drug with terrifying speed. The thing is, I didn't make that up. Those are real viruses. Those things are really happening. And in fact, just last week, news broke that a Chilean group of scientists discovered novel antibiotic-resistant genes in ancient bacteria in the Antarctic that are just there waiting to be plucked up by a virus and spread around. So it's genuinely scary stuff. And it was really that impetus when I saw that research and thought, no one is scared enough about this. And so I suppose I took it upon myself to make people scared about this. And I may have done too good a job because everybody who reads the book says it's terrifying.
Yeah, it's terrifying. I think you have done quite a good job of scaring us, but it is in a riveting way. You know, it's interesting. Well, first of all, I'm just going to have the French fries now because forget about it, and we're all doomed. You know, so someone's going to have the cheesecake, whatever. It is terrifying, but it is and it's heartbreaking, and it's this a brilliant story about how something so small can triumph over humans who we think we're so big and we think we're so smart, and humans think we're so powerful, and humans think money can buy everything and power can buy everything. But then this antagonist, as you call them, bugs, can win some of the rounds, knock on wood, at least. Part of the setting, let's talk about the world of this book, though, because we all have a vision in our brains of New York. We know now that Jacob and Amira, the detectives, and Matt, the young boy, and some other characters, a doctor and a little girl, who are all involved in this, and some other people who you will all meet. And we are talking about Child Zero, which you will not want to miss. Live in New York, in a future New York that is terrifyingly familiar and unfamiliar. Talk a little bit about making that world.
Sure. So it takes place about 10 years in the future. It's actually 2031 or so. I wanted to keep it plausible scientifically, but not so different from the world in which we live. And really, you know, I've seen a lot of people talk about this book as apocalyptic or dystopian, and I don't see that as the case at all, actually. I think, you know, the pillars of society are a little wobbly, but they're still holding strong. I mean, you know, people still go to work, they you know, have fun, they go out to eat. I make reference of a soccer camp. I don't think there are soccer camps in an apocalypse. But they live in a world in which the threat of bacterial infections is omnipresent. Now, that's happened before in the past. I mean, if you think back to the pre-antibiotic era, you know, we still survived. It was a different normal than it is now. And if antibiotics fail, we'll see a new normal again. I should say that I see a lot of people talking about how terrified they are just hearing this discussion. I will say this, in many ways, I think this is my most hopeful novel. The characters, by and large, are decent people trying to do what's right. Not the antagonists, certainly, although a couple of them are as well. But I think I wouldn't have written this book if I didn't think that the future that I portray could be avoided. I have a lot of faith in science. I have a lot of faith in humanity, or better angels, at least. Sometimes that faith is shakier than others. And so I wanted to create a world that was on a brink, but had not tipped over that edge, because I really do want it to be a novel in which there is a glimmer of hope.
Well, I think that's one of the things, I think, you know, in reading this book, and again, we're talking about Child Zero by Chris Holm, and I keep talking about how scary it is, but I think that one of the things that makes this book be important is the moral and ethical discussions in it, and the links of love and family and relationship and responsibility to each other, and how far someone would go to sacrifice him or herself for someone they love. And that is really the essence of it. And that begins at on page 1 of the book. The human stories begin, and that's what draws people in. It's sort of the science that sort of links it together, but it's how people adapt to, as you say, a new normal together, and how they try to preserve what they love and care about. Talk a little bit about how that story began and how you chose those wonderful people.
So I set a few rules for myself when I began writing this book, and one of them was I didn't want a bunch of talking heads in lab coats. Nobody wants that. Nobody wants talking heads in lab coats. Nobody wants a scene of a PhD giving a lecture. You know, that's an easy way to explain the world that I'm writing, but it's not the most interesting to read. I wanted this book to be grounded in real, recognizable people, because it's got such ripples in terms of you know, everything from economics to a rise in nationalism and closed borders and xenophobia and all those fears. I wanted to really attack that head on, which is what led me to the character of Matt, who's a child migrant. He's a mixed race. He's mestizo. He's from El Salvador. He came to this country seeking asylum, and he's a good kid. He's a bright kid. He's resourceful. He is also, in my mind, quintessentially American because he spent a good chunk of his life here, and he has such an affection for the city that he now calls home. But in some respects, and this is certainly, I think, reflects the era in which I wrote the book, he is not fully accepted by a segment of the population. He and those like him are demonized, are tried to, be stopped at the border because they could be carrying dangerous diseases. And it was really a way for me to look at how we as a society treat the most marginalized people, in times of crisis. So that was one key character. I think maybe the other key relationships in the book, my protagonist, Jacob Gibson, he lost his wife in a bioterror attack shortly after the failure of antibiotics. And now he's a single father raising a young daughter. And in many ways, his daughter, Zoe, saved his life, because if he didn't have her to care for, he might not have gotten through that grieving process with his wife. And so to me, it was really about finding these people whose lives were dramatically impacted by that shift in world, and trying to find ways in which they connect in a human way and interact. And Jake's a fascinating character. I like him a lot, but one of the reasons I like him is because, although like me, he's a straight white guy bumping along in the world on the easy setting. His partner, Amira Hassan, is a hijabi woman who rose to detective very young, and by some is considered to be maybe a token or an affirmative action hire. She's actually a brilliant detective, and he respects her. And I wanted to make sure that they reflected the world that I live in, and that's a very diverse world. And I wanted it to also reflect the fact that we've seen an awful lot of white savior stories, and I wanted to write a character like myself who's bumbling along and learning as he goes, but hopefully is fundamentally a decent person. And by trusting and listening to other perspectives, he grows throughout the course of the novel. I actually think in many ways it's incredibly hopeful, and it really comes down to the decency of that core group of characters.
Yes, I mean, I think the way the story that you tell and the story that you weave and the evolution, forgive me, of their own emotions and their own sacrifices and their own decision-making processes. I mean, I think we're talking about Child Zero, you all, and I see Shannon Hansen and Sherry and Darlene and Janine. This is so great, Catherine, and I see you all. Lynn saying, now I'm petrified. No, 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 don't be petrified. This is a story, a heartwarming, heartbreaking, wonderful story that will teach you a lot about human nature and how far people will go to protect what they have, for better or for worse, and to get what they want, for better or for worse. And you will probably, as I did, cry at the end a little bit. I mean, it's that emotional of a book. Did you cry at the end?
Yeah, I did actually, but I think they were tears of relief, because it was a long road to get this book out. It took a long time for me to wrap my head around the story, because I began with a premise, not character. Normally I begin with character. I'll hear a voice nattering in my head. And in this case, I had a premise, not even a plot, just I wanted to take place in a post-antibiotic world. I knew I also wanted to loop in research about the human microbiota, which is just a fancy name for all the critters that live in, on, and around us. Because that's the thing, I think we have this notion of microbes is terrifying. That's not the case. I mean, microbes gave us bread and beer and wine. Microbes actually, keep our bodies healthy, our digestive tract working well. They're neither good nor evil. They're just omnipresent. In fact, roughly half the cells in your body are not human. They're microbial. And we used to think they were just along for the ride. But as it turns out, they actually play very important roles in everything from mood to health. And so for me, I had this enormous set of concepts I was juggling. And I knew it was a risky book, and I many times doubted that I would cross that finish line.
But what you had to do was learn how to, what you had to do was make it into a story.
That's
And
exactly right.
did you, and this is a gorgeous, a wonderful once upon a time or once about a time kind of story. Did you know what was going to happen as you went, or did you just see how everyone reacted as you wrote it?
I'm not an outliner. I don't know whether you're an outliner. But I do usually know when I sit down to write a few things about the book. I usually have the first scene in my head. I usually have the last scene in my head, and those rarely change. They did not in this case. Both the first and last scene are virtually identical to what I had in my mind when I began writing. I usually also have a few tentpole sequences in my head. Sometimes it's just a big emotional pivot of a scene between two characters. Sometimes it's an enormous action set piece. But I usually have a few ideas throughout of things that I would like to touch on. And how I get from point A to point B to point C is always a surprise to me, which is why I always laugh. If ever a reviewer says, oh, I saw the ending coming, I always want to say, really? Because I didn't.
Right. I think that's totally so. They say, oh, I could have figured that out. I'm like, really? Because I didn't know.
Took me forever.
Thank you. The other thing go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that, for me, the joy is in finding those little moments that surprise me and then hopefully surprise the reader as well. That's the fun as a writer.
There were several, if not many, gasp-worthy moments because your readers are smart, and I think of myself as a smart reader, and I would be reading along and I think, oh, I know what's going to happen now. And then it was just not even that. It wasn't even the opposite of that. It was just something completely that I would never have thought of in my life. And I spent half of the time applauding you and the rest of the time gasping and the rest of the time turning pages as fast as I could. Let me see if I can also show you all something that you do in this book as well. Is sort of throughout interstitially in the book, there are news stories and tweets and all kinds of posters and warnings, that signs that you put in that are sort of seem like what, a shorthand, a reality check. Why did you decide to put that wonderful art throughout?
I mentioned before that I set out a few goals for myself when I sat down to write this book. One of them was, if I didn't want to write a hard science fiction doorstop of a book. I wanted to write a mainstream thriller that of the type that I grew up on. I'm thinking Michael Crichton, Robin Cook is another great example. I wanted it to be really fast and really pacey. And one of the ways I realized quickly that was a good shorthand to do that, I actually wrote probably twice as many words as made it into the book.
Oh.
Because I really pared back to make it as breezy a read as possible, despite the subject matter. And so early on, I hit on this idea. I personally love those interstitial bits in books, that sort of multimedia thing. It creates a really immersive sort of reading experience, I think. Marissa Pessel did it in Night Film, Marcus Saki in his Brilliant Saga. And I personally just really love that. The news pieces, the tweets, the all of those little, the advertisements. Yeah. And so for me, it became a way to do world building without using a lot of words. Just a single page. The one that you held up, actually, there's an entire story in the book. It's got a beginning, middle, and end that is told in its entirety in 3 news pages. It's like news segments that actually say, like, click to read more, which obviously you cannot do, about a group of people, survivalists who fix up a boat that they bought on auction from an Australia boatyard and try to sail to New Zealand, which is relatively unscathed because they have stringent biosecurity measures. That's true about New Zealand. And they want to go there and ask for biological sanctuary, is what they call it. There's a story that takes place entirely in the course of 3 pages as news pieces. And that was really just because I really wanted to include that sort of global view of the world I was writing, but I didn't want to make people wade through 15, 20, 30 pages of a C or D story that doesn't reflect on the main character. So it was a really quick, easy way to sort of paint that picture. And it also it provides a nice rhythm as well, because you've got right when the story pivots from bad to worse, you hit them with a news story where something goes awry, and it's almost signaling to the reader, boy, buckle up because something crazy is coming.
It's
And
also it's also signaling to the reader that it's real. I mean, that's one of the things that I loved about it, that there was I don't know how to put this, but that there's a life outside the pages of this novel that mirrors and reflects and embellishes the novel. So it's not just about these, it's not just, the book is not just about these people, but is everything that's going on around them, just like biology is, just like, it's the balance of how we live, from the smallest to the largest ways.
Well, and I think, I grew up a Star Wars fan, as if you needed any more evidence that I'm a giant nerd. But I think one of the things that appeals so much about the original Star Wars movies, and the reason why they've had such longevity, is because not everything was explained in detail. There would be these very lived-in moments, these very lived-in seeming characters that just kind of glance off the main story. And I was always fascinated by that. They've spent decades now fleshing out every teeny tiny character in that universe. But I feel like that's the sort of world I wanted to create, a world in which this is a story that takes place in that world, but there are countless other stories you could tell with this sort of milieu as your backdrop. And who knows if this, if Child Zero does well, even though I consider it a standalone, I could easily see revisiting it to tell other stories set in the same world.
Well, even though talk about the Christina saying love giant nerds. You have so many people applauding you in the comments. I hope, if you don't have a time to look at it while you and I are chatting, I hope you'll come back to the chat and look at it later, because we leave this up forever, and that you'll be able to respond to people if you like, and sort of take in all the adoration and accolades and applause and indications that they're all going to run out and buy this book. I got to tell you that I will never look at Central Park the same way after reading this book. Can you describe a little bit about how Central Park has changed in Child Zero?
Sure. So 3 years prior to the opening of the book, there is an extremist, a new brand of extremist, who he's essentially, he and his movement are essentially radical environmentalists. That's what they consider themselves to be. They have come to the conclusion that the Earth would be better off without humans on it, and so he perpetrates an act of bioterror that is the deadliest terror attack in history. And
I want to sort of, you'll hear about this early on in the book, so this isn't a spoiler in any way, but let's just fast forward, so let people have the experience of what happened. But what, as a result?
Sure. So as a result, FEMA ends up setting up camps, an encampment in Central Park, because there are a lot of people stranded. When that bioterror attack happens, everything gets shut down. The island of Manhattan gets quarantined, and there are certainly just some people who are not from there who have no place to go. So they end up in this camp. It has the best of intentions. It's not intended to be any kind of prison or anything like that. It's just intended to be temporary housing. And I was very inspired by a couple of things there. One, I always like the idea that the history does not repeat itself, but it rhymes. And so I was inspired by the shanty towns of Hooverville during the Great Depression. I was also inspired. I have a very good friend who is from New Orleans, and who got married in New Orleans very shortly after Hurricane Katrina. She actually wasn't going to. She brought her business back to New Orleans because she wanted to support the city she came from. And we got to tour some of the devastation and see some of these FEMA shelters that people were living in, and it was moving. It stuck with me. And so that was sort of the impetus of what becomes known as Park City in the book. Again, it was founded with the noblest of intentions, but as you can imagine, once this camp is created and the conditions are not spectacular, these people end up sort of trapped there because they're a bit of a political football. No one wants to take them in. No one wants to let them go. And so they're kind of stuck in limbo. And in a weird way, they make the best of it. They create these little villages, these little communities, and you know, they bond. They have, you know, true meaningful relationships with their neighbors. But unfortunately, it is an attack on one of those villages that's the inciting incident of the book. Matt, the young boy who the book centers on, escapes thanks to his own resourcefulness and the resourcefulness of his uncle Gabriel, and that's really what sets the plot in motion.
And the chase begins. And the chase begins. We are
And the
talking
chase
about
begins.
Child Zero, and we are out of time. I've just taken much more time than I am allowed to have talking to you, Chris, but you are amazing and fascinating. And I know we do want to take some questions from the people in the audience. Did I forget? Oh my golly, I forgot. We are giving away, Chris is giving away a copy of Child Zero at the end of the program. Oh, you should remind me the next time, you audience, you readers, you remind me about the giveaway. But we are giving away a copy of Child Zero. So if you leave a comment or a question or just general accolades and standing ovation, you will be entered to win a copy of Child Zero, and we will draw that winner in about 5 minutes after we take a couple of questions. So plenty of time for you to put up your questions. Darlene, welcome, Darlene, is asking, is Child Zero a standalone novel?
Child Zero is very much a standalone novel in the sense that I can't see it becoming a case of the week sort of thing. These characters, this is sort of the big story of their lives. I actually have enough affection for them that I kind of don't want to put them through the ringer again. But again, that said, I think the world that I created in this novel is rich enough that I personally would love to get back to it and tell other stories there. So, and thank you, Darlene, for the question.
Here's Sherry. Welcome, Sherry. Disease and vaccines are a hot topic. Have you gotten any negative feedback on the book?
So I'm going to read between the lines a little bit there. There are two types of feedback that you could be referring to. One is simply that some people are feeling a little traumatized by COVID and don't necessarily want to dive into this world just yet. I have had reviewers warn their readers that, hey, you know, this is fairly intense. So if you're not ready to go there yet, you know, maybe move it down your TBR pile a little bit, but I promise it's worth your while. But the flip side of that question, I think, is vaccine skeptics, vaccine deniers, things like that. I actually haven't had any negative feedback in that respect yet. That said, the book hasn't been out for terribly long yet, and I suspect that at some point I may. And to be honest, as a scientist and a writer, I feel like it's my job to be a good ambassador and a good communicator for the science. If someone's just going to be a troll online, I'm not going to engage them. But if they're dubious or doubtful, I'm happy to talk to them about the science behind, you know, vaccination, antibiotics, treatments like that. Because I think the trolls are a loud minority, but I do think there are a lot of people who are understandably skeptical about a lot of things. One of the things the book is about is the unfortunate intersection of race and public health. There are people in this country who have good reason to be a little dubious about healthcare. And I think, as someone who has faith in science, it's my job to you know, explain why they should have trust in the science, and also work to make sure the science is as fair and impartial as possible.
Which makes the book all the more valuable. And I'm going to echo Shannon Hansen's question, which she asked early on. Shannon says, were you always interested in science? As a little kid, were you interested in science?
Oh gosh, absolutely. I was that kid who would you know, come home from walking through the woods with like a snake in my hand that's biting me, and I just want to keep it as a pet, and my poor mom would scream and make me put it back outside. I lived for the science fair when I was a little kid. Yeah, it's always been something.
Science fair projects? Do you remember any of your projects?
Oh gosh, yes, absolutely. I remember I had this marvelous book from Mr. Wizard that had all these different great projects, and so I remember building a radio out of household items that actually worked. I remember I created a wind tunnel and made a wing out of balsa wood and attached it to a scale to demonstrate lift as the wind blows over the wing. Yeah, I was just
You
such
know,
a such a
I have to
nerd.
tell you that before I knew that I wasn't cut out to be this, I wanted to be a geneticist. And I
Oh, is that
remember,
so?
yeah, oh, I loved it and fascinated by it. And so from one of my science fair projects, I was a pretty big nerd as well. One of my science fair projects, I made a DNA molecule, the double helix,
Mm,
out of wire and colored ping pong balls that I
hmm.
threaded the wire through the ping pong balls and then tried to, and you know, it just totally fell apart. I had not figured out how that ping pong balls were too heavy to be held up by like thin wire, and it completely fell apart. And it was a huge disaster, and that is why I am where I am today. and there,
Well,
and
then the world is grateful that your DNA strand fell apart. But you hide your nerdiness way better than I do. I can say that.
well, we embrace it. We completely embrace it. I think we have time for one more question. What are you reading for enjoyment? Asks Christina.
Oh gosh. So right now I am reading the second book in Maggie Stiefvater's Dreamer trilogy. I believe it's called Mr. Impossible. My wife got me hooked on it. She interviewed Maggie for PW and said, "Boy, these books are just such thrilling escapism. It's fantasy. It's probably got a bit of a YA bent, and it's about these people who are capable of bringing objects out of their dreams, uh, and they're being hunted by sort of a shady government outfit because obviously people who can bring impossible objects out of their dreams are potentially dangerous. But the reason I'm reading it is because I have had such a tough time focusing during book tour, and she writes so evocatively and writes such propulsive novels that I'd been saving it for a slump. I knew at some point I would need a book to lift me out of a slump, and I was right that this was the one to do it. So
I'm sure that Margaret, our producer Margaret, is thinking about what is that name? What is the name of that book again? So I can put it up. It's Maggie Stiefvater, and what was the
Mr.
title?
Impossible.
Mr. Impossible by Maggie
The
Stiefvater.
the first book in the series is called Call Down the Hawk, and it's terrific. It actually ties into a previous series of hers, but you don't need to read the previous series to check this out. And I highly recommend this. It's just fun escapism with beautifully drawn characters and terrific writing.
That's and people in the book. Janine is saying bookstore tomorrow, and Christina is saying thank you. Sounds good. And Christina is also saying, as a former sixth grade teacher, the science fair talk makes me very happy, and that's great. I love that we have a connection. Oh my golly, now we are
I,
way over time. Way over
I
time.
would like to just say one thing to our sixth grade teacher. The book happens to be dedicated to two of my teachers, my ninth grade science teacher and my microbiology professor from my undergraduate experience. So I'm glad I'm making educators happy out there.
Can you tell us one thing? Oh, wait, here you go. Wait, before we do the draw, Margaret, let me just ask you, can you tell us one thing you learned from one of those teachers? What was it? Was there a domino? Was there a moment of a thing?
You know, my high school biology teacher, Nick Lepre, I was in advanced biology track, so I was taking it a year before everybody else. He pulled me aside one day and said, "I don't think you're fully engaged in my class." And I said, "What are you talking about? I have an A in your class." And he said, "Yeah, but you're not working for it." He says, "I think you've got a knack for this. I think if you applied yourself, you know, you could do this for a living." And that was so moving to me. He noticed I was checked out even though I was doing well grades wise, and he made a point of saying so. And that was a pivot point for me. That really set me on my path.
Well, you have applied yourself and done so well in Child Zero, which draws on your own scientific knowledge and your own scientific background and your love of science and your marvelous storytelling ability. And none of us who reads this will ever be the same. And that is a good thing after reading it. And let's now, thank you, Margaret, draw for the winner of a copy of Child Zero. And here is the wheel of fun spinning. Gotta love this. This has got to have some scientific basis. And the winner is Pamela Fry Priest, that's great. Pamela is a wonderful fan of Mighty Blaze and First Chapter Fun, and also of Crime Time. And we are so happy that you are here today, Pamela. And we will be sending you, Chris will be sending you a copy of Child Zero, and he will contact you. Chris, congratulations, you all. This book is brilliantly written, absolutely riveting and immersive. It's touching and philosophical and important. Please don't miss this. Chris, after 5 years of writing this, what do you think when you see this?
It's overwhelming, honestly. It's a little overwhelming to see it out in the world. I'm just glad I get to share it with everybody. And thank you so much for having me. This has been wonderful, and congratulations to Pamela. And I'm just so grateful to get to see you, albeit, virtually, and to spend time with these wonderful book folks.
They are absolutely wonderful. And let me just say very quickly before we both go, next week, you all, you're going to be back here early at 3:00 because we are double booked next week on Crime Time, this is the only place where it's really good to be double booked, right? Is Crime Time, because at 3:00 we're going to be talking to Adrian. I know. Whose book, The Island, is completely, I mean, if you're cranky and petulant because you can't go on vacation, count your blessings, because you don't want to go here. And then this is one of my favorite books of the year, Sulari Gentle's The Woman in the Library, which is a novel about a woman who's writing a book about a murder mystery. And more I cannot tell you about this, but it is brilliant and meta and clever and unique, and you will love The Woman in the Library. So 4:00, Sulari Gentle, 3:00, The Island, Adrian McKinty, and today, my books are just falling all over my desk now. Today, Child Zero by the fabulous Chris Holm. Thank you, Chris, for being here. Thank you all for joining us today on Crime Time. Remember, it is always safe inside a book, and we will see you next time.